Okay, Warcraft. So, one of the things I was trying to do recently on Warcraft is trying to get the abilities converted to JAS. So, long ago in the past, there was a time when I sort of made fun of the things that go on Warcraft Reforged, because they added Lua to the game to make it more complicated, and they also added VJAS to the game, and then they didn't actually add the VJAS natively. They added it as a stupid world editor compile where they just dumped the modding community stuff into the game. So what I've been trying to do on Warsmash is to actually natively support the same kind of idea as VJAS with a couple of enhancements, but by putting that into the game itself can work a little bit more natively. Hopefully it works even better. So to go along with that, one of the things then that I've been trying to move towards is a future where we can have Warsmash abilities written in JAS. In the past there was a time where I made a video kind of poking fun at the idea of how in Warsmash I can have all of the abilities as custom files that I could modify or replace in ways that you just can't modify abilities on Warcraft 3. But to go along with that, what we can see here is basically that proof of concept at the time was pretty good, but I've tried to take that to the next level by making it something defined in JAS, so it can actually be outside of the Warsmash engine. So you could conceivably be in an editor, you could be making a map, and maybe you want to replace what one of the abilities does. And if you think about it, you wouldn't want to recompile and redistribute the entire engine for that. You would probably just want to change some user space code. So it makes sense to have a language kind of like VJAS, and then inside that language to be able to actually replace things. So I've done several of the language enhancements and a few of my own in Warsmash recently, and then I've been just sort of trying to bring over a lot of the same sort of concepts that we would find in the Java abilities that I've implemented in Warsmash thus far, to try to put those into Warsmash abilities in JAS. So I guess they're sort of Warsmash either way, but basically it's JAS abilities. So I was working on this one the other day. I had it open here. I thought maybe I'd just have a little fun with it. You can see basically the concept here is near identical to what was in the Java. I could see if I could bring that up, but was it ability devotion? So I don't know how familiar anybody is with auras in Warsmash, but there's like 3 or 4 different ways to make auras in Warsmash, and one of them is the stuff that I was basically doing here. So this is a kind of older way to make an aura. Some people might be making auras in Warsmash with the JSON system introduced by a contributor, but around the same time, or maybe slightly prior to when that was made, I kind of just hacked some auras into the game in Java. So we can see that sort of on the right is how I did that. And this was trying to use just the very simplest version of how things should be. And so I figured that if I could define the aura as a concept, we can build on top of that with really simple portions of code to just define what the aura does. So I had that system in Java. I've more recently tried to move that system to the sort of JAS-like syntax. And in that regard, you can see on the left, I sort of ported Devotion Aura like I was doing, or started on that. So the idea is that whenever the ability levels up, we have this populate method that's called on us. And so we use basic inheritance to basically say, okay, how do we populate that? So in this case, Devotion Aura reads its armor bonus and a setting for whether that bonus is a percent. It loads that into the struct, basically, that, or class, or whatever you really want to call it, but it's sort of inspired by VJS, so I was just calling them structs. Kind of represents the aura as an ability, can store some state on that, and then because it's an aura and I inherit from sort of the default implementation of auras that I've been working on, we have the ability then to just define what does the aura's buff do, and pretty much leave it at that. So the aura has this method. It creates a buff when it's applied, and that is, then I'm just calling the create function on this sort of custom struct over here, which allocates this sort of devotion buff, and then we can tell that buff what to do when it's added or removed. So you could imagine, and I think I mentioned this once before, you could basically like call set unit vulnerable or something. Target to true when it's added and false when it's removed, and we should probably have an invulnerable aura, but we also want to try to extend that and make it actually into devotion aura. So I'm going to see if I can actually kick off the game over here. That seems like a fun example, though. Try to do invulnerable aura, but now it's something you could actually do in a map editor. You know, this could be imported in a map just as well as it would be in the game. Now, I think in order to really pull that off, I have to delete the original the original version of that. I guess it was off screen. I don't need to be off screen. So as people might know, there's a file that if we're doing abilities sort of the stupid Warcraft way where it's just all hard coded, you could imagine that would be sort of like this. This is kind of the older way I've been doing things in Warsmash, the oldest way, I guess, where we just have basically a map, and it maps ability codes to what they do. So I had done Devotion Aura that way. So if we delete it, then we know if we have any functionality in the game for Devotion Aura at all. It should either be provided by the code I was just writing or by the JSON system that was added by a contributor, and the JSON system is shut off. So that's pretty good. Looks like this did not run though, so that's kind of fun. Maybe we could have a little session where we debug Warsmash a little bit. Actually, on that note, I had realized recently, let me see if I can pop up maybe over here. Basically, so, all right, I was off screen again. If I'm in a folder, and let's say I'm in a Warsmash folder, and basically if I'm in, what is it, core assets, yeah, I think core assets logs. No, it's not core assets logs. There we go, core assets logs in this folder. Okay, so folder naming aside, I started realizing that if I basically grab the name of the last most error log, perhaps the last most JAS error log, and then I dump that out, cool, I can formulate a Linux command that prints out whatever the most recent error message was. So apparently we cannot define the struct generic passive ability to inherit from generic single icon ability. So this is kind of on me that while I was trying to define these, I was trying to get passives up and running in Warsmash. It looks like we hadn't done that yet. So in this sort of abilities common library where I was defining all the abilities, we can try to see generic passive ability is not defined on generic single icon ability. Let's just search for generic passive ability. So it's kind of fun when your JAS doesn't run to just have the engine actually tell you why. This is another thing just totally missing from Warcraft 3. It's like I try to run it and it's like, oh, it failed. Why did it fail? And it tells me. It's just, you know, it's just really how you'd want it to be. So we're extending from generic single icon ability. Apparently the actual type name is generic single icon ability base. Who knew? Okay, so we go back over here. What is it, control 11, I think, automatically launches the game. It'll probably crash again. Cool, so it crashed again, so I can go back over here. Just hit the little up arrow there, and we'll have our new set of errors to read through. So this one, no such identifier, aura buff decay time, in the definition of buff aura base. Okay, do we have a line number on that? I don't think we do. Alright, so we can go back to our code, search up buff aura base, aura buff decay time. So that's actually quite interesting because it looks like it's defined right here and it's used right after. So you could imagine there seems to be this variable here. I actually quite recently, as I was trying to get this system up and running, I had actually upgraded it to have the capacity for figuring out static struct members. And so I think what we might be seeing is that one static struct member could not automatically initialize to equate to another, which is just, that's kind of a stupid problem. It's very interesting that that problem is there. This is a consequence of trying to make my own programming language, but I guess we could add just a globals block in this library and come back and actually perhaps fix the language in another video. So to do that, I think we no longer need the keyword static. A global and public would perhaps be confusing. So suppose I delete all of that and I just have constant globals. I bet that'll fix it. Now, you shouldn't have to do that, but that's just kind of an interesting little test. Let me try running it again. We'll see where we end up. Cool, so it crashed again. It's always kind of fun doing this on Linux instead of Windows. I just hop over here in this thing. And I can print out the most recent error logs. The most recent error log says a pseudo compile failed beneath line 3422. The function getGameObjectBuffID apparently did not exist. I'm pretty sure this is because ID there is actually, I capitalized the D when I defined that function. So let's get GameObjectBuffID. This would probably be in the implementation of Auras. I think that the original on this is probably a capital D. So if we do that, oh, actually, then I just closed that file. Maybe I didn't need to do that. Let's open it back up. Cool. We'll go back in here, hit our Control F11 again, launch the game. We'll see. It's always kind of fun to see if we can get a sort of faster iteration process. If somebody's on like Warcraft Reforged trying to debug their code, it's like we're laughing at them. We're laughing at those people. Okay. Cool. So now we failed to define the struct ability Aura base because of Aura periodic check time. So that's actually another case of exactly the same problem. So I had these check times and I had them as static constants, and apparently we just don't support that yet. We just have to use globals. That's really unfortunate. I should probably fix that. In fact, to maybe go along with the idea that they would have been scoped, we could make them private globals, and that'll make it, I think that much should be supported. I deleted public before on the other one, but hopefully by doing that, I don't know, I suppose you could say maybe that's dumb, maybe a custom Aura implementation is going to want to be able to reference those variables, but yeah, for now, let's just say they exist and are private. I need to come back and just fix the language. In fact, you know what? How about we do fix the language? How hard would that really be to do? Let's have a look at that. Suppose I was going to do that. So if I needed to actually fix the way that I defined the language, and this, I don't have an undo on the other one. Well, that's kind of stupid. Of course, it's under a Git history, so we could just look in the Git history. But yeah, suppose I just change these to public static constant member variables. You can imagine we would want that to work. A user would want that to work, and it almost works. The sort of inline defining of a variable is something that exists, but it was unaware of the scoping. It was not correctly capable of referencing that other struct scoping. So essentially the reason for that is that the way that I set it up is that when Warsmash starts up, there is a function that is defined automatically whose contents are the definition of all of the globals that are in all of the files. And so all of those globals just sort of initialize and pop in before the rest of all the code runs. So if we think about it that way, I had written into the Java that we would define all the globals and do that for all of the structs as well if the structs have static members, which are, for most intents and purposes, similar to globals. So we should be able to go to where I wrote that, which I think is maybe, and this is kind of perhaps a poor naming choice, but in the global scope class for JAS, they're define functions, sort of define a method, define a function, define a struct. And so when we're actually defining a struct, it actually calls define globals in it, and that's a little bit misleading because define globals as a concept is a bit of a weird thing in that it pretty much lets us inject sort of invented JAS statements into the would-be imaginary function that is created, whose contents are never in a JAS file, but functionally exist in sort of program variables in Warsmash that it's loading, and are then used to initialize all of the globals. So in the same way that operates, this basically was saying we're going to create a set function that sets a member for every single one of these. And so it's kind of a weird thing that the set member is trying to set on the static typing info but the context within which that gets generated for executing is this sort of defined globals. So you could think about, is that maybe a consequence of the scope over here, which gets put into the instruction appending JAS statement visitor, which is sort of my pretend compiler functionality. And it's not exactly a compiler, but in order to support freezing and starting again of the VM for trigger sleeps, I went ahead and tried to basically make this thing, it's been in about the last 8 or something months that this was upgraded, where instead of walking the syntax tree and just being a direct interpreter of the JAS as the means for executing it, it sort of transfers into just a giant linear tape of instruction objects, which kind of roughly simulate what you might actually see in a compiler, although of course with much worse performance. So to that end, my instruction appending JAS statement visitor over here seems to be the problem. We're taking in a scope object, which is actually misnamed global scope, and it's not anymore. That's since been changed. That this was just the scope within which the instructions are currently being written. So for the most part, that's the current library or scope object, but also kind of wrap those for structs. And I think probably the easiest thing is that in sort of this invented function that doesn't really exist, we're just calling set member, and then we're passing it the default value expression. And so the default value expression is essentially the thing that is holding this. That is going to be a R2I function call, and within that a math.ceil function call on sort of buff decay time divided by simulation step time. And so if you think about buff decay time, herein lies the bug that we're seeing, that the code, when it tries to resolve that reference, the reference resolution, which turns into integers basically so that it can execute in high performance in my sort of pretend compiler, wants to resolve or a buff decay time as a name, turn that into an integer and find it and execute it. And that is of course failing because the scope within which we exist, which at this point is actually called struct scope, when this thing says, hey, I want to try to find, is there a global, is there a member, it basically is for most intents and purposes like missing, there's sort of an implied, in the way that I wrote it, it's sort of like there'd be an implied buff or a base dot whatever on here that wants to just sort of know and say, hey, actually this appeared to be a reference, but the reference has to be smart. And so if we think about that, in that instruction appending the sort of visitor of the syntax tree, who visits, and this is visiting the syntax tree once on initialization and then constructing off of it these sort of just indexable instructions of what to do that we can jump between and sort of pause and things like that to have a sort of pretend virtual machine. The instruction appending JAS statement visitor here actually is a place we can look to get a handle on what our problem is. So if you think about it, there's basically a reference JAS expression, and so that's part of this syntax tree that will get created with the identifier of that sort of time variable. And oh, sorry, I think I jumped my view away there. Didn't mean to do that. Try and use the hotkey to jump back to here. So we visit the reference JAS expression, and this is used in a few other places in the instruction appending JAS statement visitor. But essentially, we insert reference expression instructions for the given identifier, and this kind of jumps through some loops to say, hey, what is this variable name that we were given? You could imagine this looks kind of slow, right? This is one of these branching if statement rat's nests, but it's okay for it to be slow in this case because it only happens once on startup. So we're basically looking at this code, we're figuring out what it is, and we're turning it into something that's going to perform it at high speed when we actually run it. Hopefully that would also kind of eliminate some of the need for an optimizer. So some people would run their Warcraft 3 maps through optimizers to change all the variable names to A, B, C, and things like that. I don't have an inliner yet, so there are some cases where if you were going to run Vexorian's JAS optimizer, you might get faster code on Warsmash than if you didn't, but by and large, because I've been trying to store everything in this sort of VM-ish thing as indices instead of actual names, it should then be the result that what we end up creating should be running fast, very much like if you optimized it, even if you don't. So anyway, this is basically a giant branch that takes in the text string and says, aura buff decay time, and it says, now what is aura buff decay time? Because I need to invent a sort of pretend program that knows how to look that up. And so we know in our minds, humanly, if I was going to fix this code, the right thing to look up, what that is basically, it could have been, one option I would have had would be to convert that to a global variable with a very large name that sort of, might be wrapped within, you can imagine it might be like Aura API underscore underscore buff or base underscore underscore or buff decay time, right? And so that's kind of what VJS actually does, because everything has to turn back into the original JAS. In my world, everything doesn't have to turn back into the original JAS, so I sort of figured rather than doing that in a fairly similar way to where one of these buff auras is a struct, and so you could envision that I would, if I was inside of some type of function, and I was in there and I had like a local buff or a base, and y equals whatever. At some point I can do y dot get duration max, right? And sort of call one of these functions on that thing. The idea of y as a struct, something I can call a function on, has members and that sort of thing, I tried to kind of sort of reuse so that you can similarly say buff aura max dot create, right? And so that's sort of calling on this sort of pseudo object for the type name. So that pseudo object is in this case also the holder of the state that we actually have to locate. So you can kind of see in how this is written. We say, given the particular name, we say, hey, is this name a local variable? If it is, let's use it. If it is not, the first thing we then check is, well, is it the word this? If it's the magical keyword this, then we look up that as a special local variable that I programmed in a different way. So that might sort of override if it wasn't, and then we check again if it actually is a local variable now, and perhaps it's this local variable. We get that thing's magical integer ID, sort of just save that into the set of instructions as the thing that's going to be looked up. But if we can't do that, then you would imagine that the actual sort of this struct ID might exist as something that is present but is not the variable we're looking at. And so this would be a case where perhaps not in or buff decay time, but if like the word alias here, no, never mind, that's an argument to the function, but something like dot allocate, I guess. So dot allocate is a function, but a method, but it's there's no this. We didn't type this dot allocate. There's an implied this. So one of the first things I look for is sort of that implied this, right? And I'm saying, okay, so if the this variable exists at all, if that has some sort of non-null integer key that we're going to go off of, then we'll want to build something that actually looks up this variable with a local reference, but then on top of that executes a second instruction that is sort of a member reference instruction to look inside of a member. That's very close to what we want, but it's not. So then we look again and say, well, what about the enclosing struct type? And if we have an enclosing struct type, then we'll go in that and we'll get the global variable of our magical enclosing struct type. And this is actually, you would picture this is pretty much exactly what I need right here. And then it goes on to say, okay, if I'm going to do that, I basically create a global reference instruction, which would be what we want, would essentially be the same thing as if we typed in, buff aura base dot aura buff decay time. So it's like we're looking up that buff aura base as a global variable that refers to this sort of pseudo struct object, and then on top of that sort of does a struct member reference on that object. So that's really close to what we want, but where that fails and isn't what we want is essentially the case that the enclosing struct type is actually not getting assigned. So this is kind of part of the problem that you would imagine is going to remain a problem, because there's a function set enclosing struct type, and this is set within the defining of a method for a struct. But when we are inside the define globals function, getting inadvertently called by the define struct function, there is no such assignment to the instruction appending visitor system that's sort of operating on the original syntax tree for that particular set of statements that are going to get turned into instructions. So for that to work, we sort of have this problem that the define globals function would perhaps rather like to actually set its struct thing. And so you could imagine in some ways it takes in a scope, and it's sort of a redundant invention. Realistically, it would have been preferable if I invented a way that wasn't like this, where there's sort of scope and there's also enclosing struct type. You could almost imagine, for example, that perhaps enclosing struct type should actually be a function of the scope, and that might make a whale of a lot more sense. There is one of the scopes that I created is called struct scope and actually knows the struct name of the enclosing type, and I'm guessing when we create a struct scope, do we already have access to the struct? No, we don't. Well, that's kind of dumb. So actually the struct scope calls define struct on itself and passes through into, we end up getting to one that calls on the global scope, which is kind of weird. I was fighting with that the other day. The design of that is sort of suboptimal, but it means that we have the struct scope, and so we actually are passing the struct scope to define globals. That would be a really nice way to communicate the solution, but I had not resolved that just yet. So I guess that's an interesting thought, in that if the scope could somehow have a say, it would be really good, but it probably won't. So then I guess you could imagine, could we somehow, what if the scope is the one who's in charge of creating these instruction depending statement visitors? That's a little bit weird, but they're only really created in 3 places. One of them is when we're making a method, one of them is when we're defining a user function, obviously, and one of them is when we're defining globals, which is kind of the weirdest one, but it's so that there's this invented globals function that can kind of process this stuff. So I guess I'm inclined to think that in almost all of those cases, right now when we're defining a method, we then call this set enclosing struct type on it. But instead of that, if somehow we gave the struct the power to do it, or the scope the power to do it, we'd be really close to where we want to be. But it's sort of like we said, the scope doesn't actually have the type reference, it just has the name. And it could maybe look up the type reference, but that's still a little bit annoying. I guess it points out, so what the struct does know, the struct scope, it doesn't have a reference to its type, but it knows how to get one, because there are some cases where if you use the word this type, the struct scope is really the one who's handling this type, where, so something like one of these other structs, local this type this equals allocate or something like that. The word this type is resolved back to the struct that we're inside of using the struct scope. And so you could imagine the struct scope does have a way to actually access its own struct type thing. It basically just does that with that. And so it even actually can get the global ID of the this type. So I guess that points out perhaps the simplest and most straightforward way to do this would be if the enclosing struct type could be looked up from the global this type or something like that instead, which is kind of interesting. So if you're following me, and if you're not, I totally get it, because I've just said a lot of word salad. You could go to the instruction appending JAS statement visitor on initialization and basically say scope.getGlobalID, or maybe it's even more straightforward to just get the global from the name, which I assume would have the same check on it. Now, of course, there's kind of this option for spaghetti because the interface has both functions. Yeah, okay. So we can get a global directly, and I can say, well, how about I get the global who's named by the this type keyword. So if that is not null, this type global, and I guess it's also worth keeping in mind, we don't want to call this function if it's going to crash. It's pretty important for it to be a function that just returns null if it fails. Okay, so yeah, some fast globals map by name. Okay, sure. So we get this type global. So basically, if this type global is not null, then this type global is going to, we want to get the value of that. Okay, and so this is the this type value. And basically, if the this type value is itself not null, then, so one thing you could do is sort of casting to convert it to the type it needs to be, but rather than doing that, I have visitors that operate sort of like casting. So you could imagine it's a JAS value. I have a static struct type JAS value visitor thing, which, despite its long name, basically gets us the static struct type, which is sort of this object that exists as that sort of pseudo struct I was talking about. And that's not exactly what we want. We actually want the struct type definition, which was kept separate from that sort of pseudo object struct-like thing. So that actually, I think, has a get static type, which actually gets us the desired static type. So essentially, and I should do some more checks on this because these functions can definitely return null. And so if any of these things are null, we're just going to skip doing this. But if the static struct type is not null, then I should be able to get the static type off of that and then basically say this dot enclosing struct type equals the static type. At that point, I could probably eliminate the enclosing struct type method. And we've just created a way that we've eliminated redundancy, that we should no longer have to set struct type. And as a result, anywhere that we're inside the scope of a struct, basically, we're going to automatically use whatever the keyword this type resolves to, and that'll be what the instruction appending statement visitors see as the enclosing struct type, rather than some hack of passing something through that sometimes is defined and sometimes is not. Hopefully that gets us where we want to be here, and I know that's that was a lot. That was a lot to get to an end result. But you know what the end result was? And I sort of like to go for this end result. My initial instinct of how I wanted to write this code and having a public static constant variable, I think that's an acceptable instinct, and I think that the end user might want to have that too. And so by actually improving upon the VJAS language parsing universe that's built into the system, now we can just have that, you know, how you'd want it to be. So I think that seems pretty good. Cool. So actually it started on my other screen over here. I don't know exactly why that is, but previously we were always crashing. Now we got to a map loading screen, so that's a really positive sign. Maybe we'll have something cool now after we fix that, which is always kind of fun. You know, rather than editing my JAS code, I edited the system to accept a wider range of code. I am not afraid. So if I could learn devotion aura, oh, okay. Double free or corruption fast stop. That's kind of fun. So we can go over here to our little debug. We can try to see what did we fail on. And yet again, one of the things that is just laughably missing from anyone who tries to mod Warcraft 3 and is not missing from my universe is telling me where in the code that's executing that we had a problem. Now there's a stray function over here, Blizzard Wave. I had included on my code that loads, but it's not relevant to anything. It has some missing variable tau. So we don't care about that. So we actually care about this most recent error when it crashed, which is apparently devotion line 29. And so I would imagine, you know, we could go to the devotion aura ability thing, line 29 here. So this is the allocating of the devotion aura ability itself. And that makes total sense. We noticed that when I clicked to learn the hero skill, that would be when it would actually create the devotion aura ability and give it to him. That failed. Its allocate method, which is calling to basically this allocate. And allocate, you might notice, is not declared anywhere. It's implicit. So it has this like init 0 thing. It's basically saying it doesn't know what line of code that came from. It's just some automated initialization. But it redirected us to line 3406 in abilities common. So 3406 is actually one of these ones we were just looking at, which basically calls .allocate there, and it was saying that that failed because what? Something weird. So it cannot invoke set member of a struct because the struct is null. So that's kind of an interesting one. So it's saying perhaps that the automatic allocate failed. I don't actually know exactly why that is. I would imagine that it might be next area check equals 0. I'm curious if we just do a test. If I say this dot next area check equals 0 manually, does the implicit, you know, is this another Warsmash bug hitting us that it's not even anything to do with the code? I don't really know, but it might be. I wouldn't put it past myself to have done that. Sorry, we're back to the loading screen, off screen over here. Let's see. Sure is nice not having to go through a lion doorway or, you know, to run on a Microsoft computer or any of that other stuff to get through things. All right, here, where do we go?
Let me face the better.
Paladin, aura. Okay, we still exploded. But did we explode on the same thing? It's always an interesting question. No, we exploded on a different thing. So I mean, that's quite interesting, right? So that points out, and I sort of kind of want to put it back. I'm going to do the same idea again to say that the user of Warsmash is going to expect that he can just say integer equals 0. And apparently that explodes, where it's like implicit in allocate, where it's sort of like, okay, if we're automatically, oh, I don't want to do a drag there, but yeah, if we're calling allocate, there's this sort of implicitly generated function. I don't know, I mean, maybe I broke that when I was doing like this keyword, this type stuff. I'm not exactly sure. So if we go to struct.js type, where the concept of a struct is implemented and natively into the game engine, there is a point where we're building things that I basically say, if I am inheriting from some other kind of struct, which we are doing because this is an aura, and aura abilities inherit from passive abilities, then because of that, I basically copy the contents of the function, the sort of create method of that other struct, and put that into what the allocate of this struct does. It's a paradigm that really I think is kind of stupid and weird, but I tried to maintain the paradigm from VJS so that people who are familiar with Warcraft 3 could use the same stupid and weird paradigm for writing their code. So in order to facilitate that, I wrote all of this, which is basically looks up the create method in the super type and says, okay, here's the create method of the super type, and so I should be able to look through the parameters of that and write some function that literally just is a method call to that create function, but I sort of inject into it something that there is no equivalent JAS keyword for, but essentially changes how it functions so that rather than allocating that other type of struct, we allocate our type. So the end result is what it needs to be, which is strange and sort of silly, but you can imagine the way it was written. Otherwise, that other create method, by default would sort of allocate the wrong type. It's like you sort of create something once, right? And that thing that you've created is that particular type. And in Vexorian's VJS, all structs were integers, and so they weren't really that type. They were just numbers getting allocated and sort of referring to other things. I actually do sort of type things and keep a struct, so it becomes this bizarre reallocating what's it, but it seems to work. So I'm doing that, and then I generate the default allocate statements, which I think is perhaps the most important here, which becomes a list of statements that become the new allocate method, which is what we're calling. So it's sort of like this generator here is actually, we're looking at the statements to generate, and we're looking at what's going to get added, and they're default member initialization statements, and somehow when we added those, they exploded. And so you could think about where did that happen? And it seems to have happened basically here. So we tried to set a member on that. We tried to say, I want to set this value, but it couldn't work because the struct itself was null. And that's a really odd one. That suggests that my default member initialization statements were there and they were populated, but that this keyword was messed up and was empty. And I think that makes sense. If you think about it, the idea that the this keyword is empty is true because this is a static method, and this, so in some cases the word this is an actual keyword. Like down here, this.source equals source. Nobody made a local variable this. There's not an argument to the function this. It's this implied thing, it's this, the struct that we're inside of. But create is a static method, so create doesn't have that. Create just has a local this type this. That being the case, popping that local this type this inside sort of this create method does nothing for the automatically generated allocate method. So the automatically generated allocate method basically is wrong, and my intuition about using keyword this for it is also wrong. I think that's probably what we're seeing, which is kind of interesting. So we could think about, there's two options to that, right? One possibility is, I guess what we have here. Define a local definition this, which tries to literally equal, okay, so the type token is this, and the value is our creation expression, which is the thing we defined earlier, which calls the create method of the other struct, but in a specialized way. So it's, those behaviors applied to us. So now I'm actually second guessing why this would be broken, because keyword this should have been fine. So you know what might be missing? In all honesty, one thing that I think might be missing. If we go to ability spell passive in its create method, I wonder if it doesn't return anything in its create method, if it's like broken. Yeah. Apparently it has almost no code in it at all. It's just like implicitly defined. So I wonder about that. Ability spell interface is again some implicitly defined thing. Abstract thing instant. This one is correct. Wait a minute. That's broken. Why is it instant? It shouldn't be instant if it's passive. Hold on. I threw myself off with function searches here. Abstract generic passive ability would be the one that I would be looking for. Sorry. Its create method also returns this, however. So I'm not immediately certain what is actually the deal there. Which is kind of interesting. So we're back to where it still says the struct is null. But I don't know why the struct is null. I wouldn't have expected it to be null. It allowed us to generate code that refers to this object. But for some reason, this object is null. So we're not able to set its member automatically. I'm a little bit unsure of why this is. We have a creation expression coming in that should be used to essentially provide a value to keyword this. Well, here's another thing, again, laughing at anyone that would ever use Reforged. I can basically go into a debugger and actually debug this at the time that it fails. It seems kind of interesting, and maybe we can have a look-see at what is the code that we think that we're running, and what does that code think that it's doing. So if I would like to do that, I guess the first thing is we could go to our sort of pretend compiler output, and there's this thing called set struct member instruction, which is where it said it actually failed. So this is using my sort of pretend stack that we're executing on, and sort of it's looking at the top of the stack as an item and turning it into a struct, and then trying to set the member on that struct. So if I basically go into that system and put a breakpoint, but actually we don't exactly want a breakpoint. Really what we want is something like if struct equals null, then we're going to crash anyway. We can make whatever kind of exception we want, but by literally typing it out, I can debug on it. And I want to delete that later, but that's just a decent debug. So I can run on that. We can get to the bottom of it. Yeah, and then we'll see what's up, and yet again, you think, why can't Warcraft 3 have tools like this? I don't know. It's because Microsoft's stupid, and, I'm not even on Windows over here. I'm on something much better. I'm on Pure OS, which is endorsed by the FSF, the Free Software Foundation. Which I think is really good. It's free as in freedom. It's like freedom from tyranny, like Microsoft.
What would you ask of me?
All right, great. So I'll learn my ability, and you can see now that'll freeze, getting me to a point where I can switch to a breakpoint and go and analyze what's really happening in the debugger. Again, laughing at anyone who would ever use Reforged. So here I am in a debugger, and this allows me to go and look at, here I am with the set struct member instruction, and currently inside of this, in this sort of JAS thread universe over here, the struct that I tried to reference, the concept of this thing, is just it's just nothing. It's just null. So what we want to do is actually look at it, and this might be a little bit hard for you guys to see, but there is an instruction pointer, 42,202 over there on the right, which is my instruction pointer that I use for my sort of virtual thread concept. That tells us where in the linear stick of all sort of functionality that we're doing. So you could think of it as a JAS bytecode, so to speak, but it only exists in memory. That instruction pointer, 42,202, is what we need to go look at. So inside of global scope in instructions, we can remember that number, 42,202. 42,202, and we can go navigate to that, 42,200, 42,202, and you can see 42,202 is a local reference instruction. So essentially, we get the second local, we set the 14th member of the struct, and then we reference the second local again and return it. And so this is obviously a consequence of that same thing we were just looking at. It is fundamentally, we reference this, we set the value of this, and then we reference this again. And so I guess an interesting oddity there to try to think about is, what is the thing that we're setting the struct member 14 to be? And that we would have to scroll down a little bit more so we can see a little bit more of this stuff. But it was pushing a literal integer. So we're pushing the integer 0. So this again, this makes sense. We're looking at exactly what we want to be looking at. If you think about down here in sort of ability Aura universe, the problem is next area check equals 0. So evidently next area check is the 14th struct member, and I know when you look at this you're probably thinking that's not the 14th struct member, that's the second, 0, 1, 2, or I suppose you would call that the third. The third struct member, but you have to remember there's a whole bunch of stuff inherited from structs above, so as it happens in my current universe, it's the 14th struct member. So 14th struct member is basically supposed to be assigned, and so then we're back to where, well, we get that, we get the local, and we set its 14th struct member equal to 0. And that should work, but it doesn't. And surely the reason for that is that we somehow have a null struct from returning our stuff. So we'll notice we have a type check instruction over here, which is also type checking the return value. And those I think are turned off maybe if you exit the debug mode or disable type checking or something like that. I know there's a way to make all this stuff run probably faster than it does if you didn't want all these debugging systems, but yeah, the type check instruction basically is checking that it's ability or a base, and that didn't seem to crash. So we're back to looking at the really suspect part of this is probably the whole allocate-y kind of stuff. It's basically like allocate as a new type, which is sort of interesting. So when you think about what does allocate as new type instruction actually do, allocate struct as a new type, it does peek at the end of the stack frame and then hack it, and so it's not doing anything else special. So yeah, I guess you could imagine we're making we're calling a function, and then we're doing this wacky thing to it that makes the struct be sure that it's the right type, which is, it's something. But this function that we're calling, we call it on the 2 arguments. And so if you look at method create, it's interesting that it is implied that ability spell passive constructor actually has 2 arguments. That is in and of itself weird and throwing me off a little bit. You see that where it's like we reference 2 locals. We're calling allocate, this invented function, and the invented function references 2 local variables and calls a function of 2 arguments, which does not align with the idea of ability aura base calling a function of 1 argument. That's very interesting. So you look at ability spell passive. This might be where we went wrong. Ability spell passive calls ability spell interface, which calls a generic passive ability. I mean, all of these are going to have sort of implied redirects, but we do eventually have generic passive ability, which creates an order button passive with an order ID. Now it is sort of interesting to think, why does a passive need an order ID? That seems very stupid. But it is a consequence of being a native. So it's interesting to think, does devotion aura want to actually pass its order ID, even though one might make the case that that does not make sense. This might be the root of our problem. So essentially, the actual super types we're expecting yeah, that's really interesting that even ran at all, but I guess it's based on the idea that somehow the native, when we actually call to this native that is like create order button, it's suggested that the native should have exploded. It didn't look like it did. I'm not sure, but it would have presumably not had the right argument count, and then I don't know where that goes from there. That might be related to why it exploded, though. Okay, so we go in here to ability or base, and we say, all right, I want to pass the order ID into that. So I'm going to allocate alias order ID, save that. You know, that might honestly fix it. It looked like devotion. I was actually doing that anyway. It's devotion order ID. It's super pointless. It doesn't. You can't click on it. It's not going to issue an order on the icon. But you know, it is what it is. So let me just shut off the game and try again. See if that fixes it. I think if that does fix it, we're probably going to have some other problem. The other time I was testing, there was something else that failed after. Hopefully we'll be back to that thing, which seems pretty good. Just loading for a minute there. Cool. Okay, so here's my paladin. Learn my devotion aura. Game explodes. Now we have to ask, why does it explode? So it looks like the reason it's exploding is that we cannot cast an ability to an unrelated type buff aura base. So, in my opinion, buff aura base should be a related type. It should be an ability. You might notice I was doing a cast. This is something that Vexorian might have had in his universe of BJAS, but I'd like to think I'm a little bit ahead of him. So what I was doing in these auras is there is a point at which I get the ability. So this get unit ability, it's basically the BLZ get unit ability, on same idea as what was on Reforged, but mine doesn't have a BLZ on it. It's just a good clean name. So I get the unit ability, and then I cast it to buff aura base over here, which is a really kind of special, fun concept, right? To think that the actual ability on the unit can be casted back to my JAS type. You know, that's something that you probably could not do in Blizzard's Warcraft 3. You would need some kind of index or hoopla that your ability maps to some other. Anyway, I don't even want to think about it. You know, it's just, we're not doing that. So I get unit ability and then I cast it back to a buff aura base. And it looks like I'm going to have to patch the system again. That apparently our casting mechanic doesn't actually understand how to cast from ability handle type to buff aura base, you know, JAS struct type, which I kind of thought I had prepared it to do. So let's look at typecast to struct visitor line 63. So if you think about, is that even the right one? Through some kind of exception. Oh, that's to string. Yeah, that fooled myself. Okay, to struct is what I want. 73. So to be honest, part of the problem is I started off with these exceptions I was going to throw, where I was thinking like, oh, I'll just throw exceptions when casting fails. And then I realized it's much cleaner. You know, we don't have exceptions in JAS that the user can catch right now. I didn't implement that. So we're instead going to just return null if it fails, which is actually more along the lines of what I expected over here. So basically I have like if existing buff equals null as like a concept. And I think that's pretty much what we want. Now again, it's a bit odd that we threw an exception. It might still. I mean, I am a little bit curious actually. It's a little bit curious to me that it didn't follow this other path. It didn't say, oh, it's an extensible handle that's extended by JAS, and so why don't we just get its struct value and then use that on the same type we have here, and then that struct will look at itself and say, oh, you know what, am I the destination type, or can the destination type equal me, and if it does, I return myself. We didn't do that, so I don't know. I don't know if it'll actually work, but certainly we can turn off the exception and just say that the cast returns null, which is actually my intention for the cast syntax at this point. The exceptions I was doing earlier, something I'm probably not going to continue with. But I wonder, why would it have been that it had a buff that was not null, but it would not cast? Oh, hey, look at that, my paladin's invulnerable. Well, that's kind of fun. So it did turn my paladin invulnerable, you know. Anything else aside, we got that much. I don't know if it turned other people invulnerable. So he's turning everybody invulnerable. So they have, like, this buff, probably.
Wait till you see me in action. At your call.
Oh, but it's weird. Wait, the buff is, like, expiring and returning. So can he, like, out-of-range them?
I am here.
Oh, yeah, so he can out-of-range them, but it doesn't show...
I am here, mortal.
It doesn't show the actual buff like it should. It's just making them invulnerable until he walks away.
Evil is near.
Which is weird.
At your call.
That's a weird thing.
Evil is near.
At your call.
Evil.
It seems like something I should fix. So,
what would you ask of me?
Do you see something?
It's also interesting that the mana bars are...
You require my assistance?
Somehow the health bars are not always showing. It's become broken. You know, I see a health bar and then it disappears. Why is that? It's not what I expected. I haven't seen that one before. That'd be something else we could look at. But yeah, basically, I would really like to see the buff icons on this one. It's interesting to me that we don't. So... that's one thing to fix. And then the other thing is, obviously this buff is like expiring and re-adding itself. And the idea that it's expiring and re-adding itself suggests that probably this buff aura base is casting and is becoming null. So it's saying, oh, I'm a null buff. So I have to add a new buff. It's just weird. I'm actually going to add a debug line right here, just, you know, BJ debug message, called refresh expiration. I'm curious if this ever gets called. Seems like if it doesn't, something's broken. And obviously there's other stuff to do, but I'm just curious. Are we ever calling my refresh expiration function? So essentially this was my attempt to bring the Java-based auras into the JAS. Now, I don't know, I mean, maybe at some point we could do the same thing with however the auras work in the JSON universe. I haven't been doing that just yet, but it definitely looks like it's not calling refresh expiration or any like text printout. So, I don't know why that is. That's kind of interesting. Refresh expiration. Does make you wonder why that doesn't work. I'm refreshing the expiration, you know, and so you would think that would periodically refresh. So I think what that tells us is that my cast is still failing. Fundamentally, if we go back to where this sort of bad cast was happening, this is another case where I should probably breakpoint on it and have a look at, you know, what are we really comparing here? What is the variable that we're coming up with when we try to do this cast? Be a really interesting question. I guess off screen it's doing the load bar. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it'll probably crash and we'll just have to jump back to the code editor anyway. It's totally expected.
What would you ask
Cool.
of me?
Okay, so here's my paladin. We'll give him devotion aura. That seems good. All right, we'll switch over to debugging. So what is the value that we're given? What is this thing? Oh, it's null. Right. So then I don't care, actually. I guess part of the problem. Yeah, no, here's the problem. Okay, I think I know the problem. Well, part of it, not all of it, but if I kill that, sort of undo, put this thing back. So getting null, so if we look at, this idea that I have get unit ability, a function that looks up a unit ability, and it says, basically, I use my get ability by raw code visitor, and I visit the ability, and I check for a certain raw code, and if it has that raw code in that ability, I return it back. And there are a bunch of different kind of raw codes in Warsmash that might or might not match that. Curiously, buff appears to be handled, and so really the problem is what is the raw code returned by buff jazz, in my mind, because it has an alias and a code ID. An alias is the one passed down from above, which is sort of the one passed in. So I guess maybe we should breakpoint on that and see when we call buff jazz what actually is the alias that is getting passed in. Is that our four-letter ID that we want it to be? Because it should be BHAD. Buffs human aura devotion. It's interesting to wonder if it's not, why that would be. We're getting there though. Alright, cool. Yeah, let me just do one of these. We get over here. Yeah, switch and check. What is the alias? Okay, so the alias is 0. So that's super broken. This points to some kind of crazy going on here. Alias should not be 0. Right? It's like we're calling with zeros in alias ID and code ID. And you go and look at what do we think we're doing, right? And so what we think we're doing is that we think we're calling create buff. Actually, no, that makes sense. Create buff being broken like that. What alias and code do we think we're passing in? Hold on. So devotion creates a buff with buff ID. It allocates with alias ID, and it allocates buff aura base. Buff aura base itself takes an alias and passes the alias into buff timed. So then it's like, well, we think buff timed is like a buff that has some concept of expiration and an art attachment, and it passes its alias into its super type, which is buff, which has a static method that defaults to allocating of alias in both values. So it would almost make sense if it weren't for the fact that it was 0. I guess we're back to get buff ID. So there's a problem that get buff ID in create buff somehow is returning 0. That makes sense. That's probably what it is. So get buff ID as a method get buff ID in aura base. So method get buff ID in aura base. It gets buff ID, which tries to read from get game object buff ID at the given level index 0 when we call populate data. Now, does aura spell passive call populate data? I mean, you would hope so. Oh no, okay. So this is a problem. My JAS-like, VJAS-like syntax, it's missing the final keyword, the ability to declare that your subclass cannot override you. Without that keyword, you can override populate data, but really I meant to override populate aura data. The thinking there is that the populate data function by itself in aura by default parses out the buff ID from the world editor data, and then it leaves to your ability implementation to just populate Aura specific things. It keeps the code in the Aura file short, was my thought process. So if I populate Aura data in the Aura file, that makes sense. But if I populate, if I use populate data as the name in the Aura file, then I end up overwriting the method from the parent type, which essentially nukes the portion of this that would actually parse the buff ID, which ends up leaving the buff ID as a default 0 value inability Aura base, which then is returning that as the buff ID that I create with the buff, which is interesting, and it ends up meaning that the buff would always reapply. It could never find itself once it adds itself to a unit, which kind of makes sense. So I think this would probably fix everything I just changed. It would probably fix where the invulnerable buff was sort of blinking on and off. But I think what it does not really fix, and I don't know yet why it's even a problem, is that abstract cbuff by default is not successfully applying its icon. So you could imagine, oh no, I know, that's right, it wouldn't apply its icon because the raw code is 0. So the icon is getting determined by the world editor data in the sort of default case. That data was 0, now it is not 0. I bet this is, yeah, look at that. Now you can see a little Aura applied on him. It does still appear to be double applying though, which I'll admit is not what I expected. So it seems like getting, you can see it reflashing on them. That periodically the Aura just kind of reapplies to everybody nearby, which I think is an interesting reminder for sort of how I implemented it. It's almost like you're just periodically casting a short duration battle roar or something. But that's not how it's supposed to be. They're not supposed to constantly flash like that, where you sort of delete the buff and re-add it.
I am not afraid.
The way that should be is that it sees itself and calls this refresh expiration function that's not getting called. So that's kind of interesting. That would be interesting to figure out why that's not getting called. But I think that this is all rooted in basically when I create that buff, I'm obviously passing the alias down through it, and so I don't really need my abstract buff JAS breakpoint anymore, which actually, was there another instance of the game running still that was stuck on that? Yeah, okay, so we want to kill that. Yeah, I don't need that now, but you can imagine where I'm still failing is this sort of cast that when I do my type casting thingamajig, right here, we are not, oh, is that a breakpoint? When I try to cast it, there was nothing there. It was null. And I don't really know why that is. Because presumably it should not really be null. Maybe. That's kind of interesting to think about. You would think that it should now find it. Now I guess this does point out, what is the ID that it thinks it's looking for? It thinks it's looking for get buff ID, which as we just fixed is now a valid value. It's now able to load the art and data like that because it has an editor data value properly loading for the buff ID. But that doesn't really explain why in finding the nearby unit and in saying, does he already have the buff on him? I'm always getting false. I'm always not finding that buff, instead of getting into a case where I could call refresh expiration. And I don't really know why that is. Now, one idea would be, is something wrong with these level mechanics where I tried to do something? So we could put updating buff level, and I don't really expect that that would activate, but that's something else to look for, because it's either that, or it's that get ability, by raw code just didn't even work. Basically, if we're here and we're trying to get an ability, I probably want a breakpoint on that too. So we've got the debugger, we've got the breakpoint, we've got the logging printing out in the JAS. Hopefully we're just to a point where we're going to solve this one for the next run here. I would think that we will. Which would be pretty nice, if I get this working. I'll have my Java Aura system just put into totally in JAS, so you could have it replaceable, modular, something that you would put in a map, you know, optionally if you want to, or you hack it, you delete it, change something. Maybe you like the buffs flashing periodically.
As you wish.
Alright, what do we got? So it pretty much instantly jumped over here. Switch to this. Okay, so what? This raw code is AHHB. What is that? Oh, this is some other thing. It's looking for abilities, human. What is this? Okay, so what I'm seeing is that's something totally irrelevant that I don't care about.